Good evening. My name is Joe Hale. I'm the director here at Dreamland. I want to welcome you all. Thank you all very much for being here. We appreciate it. We're the only organization on Nantucket that loves rainy days. Very, very productive for us. I want to thank you for being here. I also want to say, if you're not a member of the Dreamland, we're now open 364 days a year. The only way we're going to continue to be open 364 days a year is if we get the community to support us. So if you're not a member, I ask that you think about it. There are brochures all over the place in the bathrooms. Just grab one, and it starts at $40. And let's face it, you get free popcorn every time you come in. It's worth it. So think about becoming a member. We need you. The Vineyard has an art house cinema. They have 2,200 members. We have 800. I'm very competitive. At some point, we're going to surpass the Vineyard. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to tell you that on Thursday night, we've got Ben Mesrick speaking here. Ben Mesrick wrote The Social Network, one of the premier nonfiction writers in the country. Wrote The Social Network, which was made into a movie, nominated for 8 Academy Awards. He's writing a really fascinating book right now called Woolly, and it's based on a project at MIT where they are using DNA that they've extracted from amber to recreate prehistoric woolly mammoth. And it's a fascinating story, and it's already been optioned for a film. And so Ben will be with us 5 o'clock Thursday night here. And then Vice President Biden will be speaking at the Page to Stage series on November 25th. That's the Saturday of Thanksgiving, if you're around. He's going to be speaking at a Page to Stage series. So, with that, I want to thank you again for being here. This is going to be rebroadcast on Nantucket Community Television. You can look at their schedule to find out when. We've got a fascinating speaker tonight, and we've also got a fascinating interviewer, moderator. Rob Capuzzo, as many of you know, is the editor of N Magazine, and he's an author in his own right. He wrote a fascinating book last year called Tracking the Wild Pumbaa. He spoke at our Page to Stage series last year, and it's a fascinating read as well. David Gregory, many of you know, has had a distinguished broadcast career, but his book is a really compelling and interesting journey that he's been on. And I heard David speak last year, and it was a really inspiring talk. So with that, please join me in welcoming Rob Capuzzo and special guest David Gregory.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I think we have a very unique opportunity tonight. And as we were just discussing before we went on, I think the audience might be split down the middle on what we want to discuss tonight. On one hand, we would love to talk about David's spiritual journey that he captures beautifully in his book, which I'd highly advise if you haven't read to read. And then I'm sure there's going to be folks that are interested in his take on the world today and the state of politics, a lot of the insights that he has in his career. So I thought to start things off, given that this is the Page of Stage, we start with the book.
Okay.
You cover so much and achieve so much in the book. It's on one hand a memoir. It's a spiritual journey. It serves as a historical exploration, a lot of our modern history. What compelled you to write this book, kind of putting your faith in a very public space, which, as you noted to me before, was a surprise for a lot of people?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Rob, for doing this. Thank you all for coming out. It is a nice night to gather together and talk about the things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, God and politics. That's all I talk about. So I do the really hard stuff all the time. I never really thought I had a book in me, and I certainly didn't want to write about my career because I thought I was too young and didn't think I really had my voice yet. I was really mindful of people that I admired a lot who didn't write that kind of memoir until much later, and then the memoirs they did write were really only derivative of their careers, whether it was Tom Brokaw writing about World War II veterans or Tim Russert writing about the relationship with his father. And I think this is something that's just become so important in my life, which is really, it is a return, it's the story of my return to faith as an adult, but it's really, I think, about the yearning that we all have in life. I mean, we all come to a point, at whatever point that is, where we stop and we look inward and we say, well, what is it all about? What am I really after? What gives me a sense of purpose? What drives me? Is this all there is? And what more is expected of me? And so I think these questions start to come up. They, for me, came out of a sense of gratitude, out of a sense of great success. And then as I write about, the book project coincided with, a very difficult passage for me in my career, losing my job at NBC and how public and embarrassing that was, just because of the nature of how it was handled. So you put all those things together, it became something that was pretty real and pretty raw to share. And I just felt like that was most important. And I'm not, unlike my wife, who I do write about in the book, I'm willing to share. It's shocking as my wife still finds that. And so I think that, I felt that in a way, I remember my publisher, the great Jonathan Karp, who is the publisher of Simon & Schuster. He said, what you really want in a book is for someone to interact with the book and say, you know what, that's not really about him, it's about me. And I hope there's aspects about all of you in my story, because there's so many things that we share. And so I think that's what really drove me.
Were there any instances since the book has been out that have surprised you from some of your readers where they've kind of come to their own revelations through reading your book, or people that have been in your sphere that came to you and said, David, it's amazing how this touched me because I had been kind of fearful to bring this voice to the forefront?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is I think people were surprised that I wrote this. I mean, I just think, people know me from being on the news. I've covered the White House. I did Meet the Press. I'm on CNN now. So they're not thinking about this aspect of life. I don't think a lot of people are looking to journalists to have a deeper relationship with God. I mean, I don't think that's the two things that people think necessarily go hand in hand. So there's the element of surprise. I think the biggest thing is I really have come to feel with conviction that at a time when religion is under siege and people are less interested in becoming more religious, at the same time, there is a deeper spiritual yearning that people have that they don't necessarily have the vocabulary to express. And it's finding the vocabulary to speak to your own yearning that I think makes people feel a deeper connection in their own lives. And I think that's what I've come to feel. I don't get it right all the time, and it really is a journey and a process, and it's up and down. But I think that we all, at some level, feel the yearning. There's one of my favorite rabbis, David Ingber in New York. He said, Jews, we have a Trinity as well, not just the Christians. He said, we have a yearning, a learning, and a turning. That sense of that God being at work inside of you, stirring your soul to ask questions, to go deeper, to want to connect with something that's bigger than ourselves. We have a great emphasis on learning, on studying the Torah. And the turning aspect, it can be in the Gospels, as the Good Samaritan turns to see what's in his path, or it can be in the Hebrew Bible, that Moses turns to notice the burning bush, so that we're turned from our path to see what else is there, what needs tending to. And I think people have surprised me when they say, yeah, you know what, this spoke to me because I'm feeling some of those things.
And one of the really refreshing, for me, in reading the book, one of the refreshing elements to it is that the search takes you to other faith traditions which you are willing to glean truths from and hold up in their own validity, not as a Jew or as anybody,
right,
but just as observing as a person on a spiritual journey. How do we get to a place as a society, or what small steps can we take where that type of appreciation of other religions happens on a more day-to-day basis within our interactions?
Look, I think religious institutions have a lot of work to do. I mean, institutions are under siege in our society, from politics to finance to media to religion. And there's lots of good reasons for that. A lot of bad things happen in the name of religion. A lot of things get in the way of a relationship with God. And yet I happen to think that religious traditions are still really valuable. So I belong to a synagogue that I think is a great place. I don't think it's perfect, But it generally comports with my view of the world, not always, but generally does. And so yeah, I sought out people like Cardinal Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. He's a little bit more conservative and progressive religiously than I am. But I think he's incredibly intellectual and deeply spiritual, and so I learned something from him. I went to go see Joel Osteen, and I didn't know what I'd get because I thought, oh, this might be a guy who's just telling me that the answer to what I'm looking for is just believe in Christ and I'll be all set. But that's not what he said. He was much more humble. And he said to me, what I think is important is that you have a heart for God. And that still takes my breath away. Like, right, that's exactly what I feel. Is like cultivating, having a heart for God, and letting God in, and opening your heart to God. That he provided the vocabulary for what I was feeling. So yeah, I think there's things to take from other people, but I've talked to, again, these tend to be more conservative people religiously who don't like this idea of people who are just on a journey. They're all on the journey, and you're always questioning, and you're journeying along, and you're never really arriving. So I'm actually a believer. No, I believe in arrival. I do. But the whole idea of journeying, and as you get closer to the horizon, a good friend of mine who's, soda or popcorn?
Mike and Ike sounds like.
Mike. She talked, as we get closer to the horizon always keeps getting farther away, right? So, so these things keep moving, keep changing. I think that's what Pope Francis represents. I think, look, within orthodoxy in Judaism, there's evolution, there's changes. It's true among evangelical Christians. It's true in the Catholic Church. There's all kinds of evolution that has to happen. So to answer your question, I'm rooted in a tradition and a paradigm. I've had people try to convert me. And it's funny, the more I've studied Christianity, the more I've been exposed, the more Jewish I feel, because that's where home is for me. And I feel more deeply rooted in that home. And I'm a believer in that. So I'm a believer in pursuing a religious tradition deeply and thoroughly, kind of with all the difficulties and with the challenges that these religious traditions face.
Would you say that it's to the end goal of being a better person, or is it an end goal of being closer to God? And most might be one and the same. But is the definition of religion the path that's best for you to be a better person, get closer to God? Does that definition hold true to you?
Yes, ultimately, St. Augustine, essentially, his point of the Confessions is that human beings get into trouble when they think that they've got this covered. Like that, well, I can just figure this out. I don't really need God. I'm one who thinks, no, in my life, that's not enough. For me, I need to draw closer to God as a Jew, as a person of faith, because the process of deepening that relationship will, if I am really listening, and if I'm inspired, and if I'm walking in the way God wants me to walk, then I will be a better person, because I will do the things that are expected of me. And that is a higher calling. I think there's other ways to get there, to pursue goodness. That works for me. I believe in it, and I think it's not just a question of, as a Jew, I am not one who believes in turning my life over to God, or that God has my whole life planned out for me. I haven't figured all that out, but I don't have that complete surrender as Christians would, at least theologically. I think I bear too much responsibility, but I believe in grace. I believe I've experienced grace. So it's not just a question of going on a diet or not. It's a question. It's something has happened in my life, and I've allowed it to grow, and it's a beautiful thing. So it's not. I don't view it as so much of a choice as much as being touched.
One of the chapters in your book explores the role faith played in President George W. Bush's presidency, and then also some other leaders, Tony Blair, Jimmy Carter. What role would you say faith is playing in the current presidency?
Well, I just think that it's a very different models. I mean, and I don't mean that in, President Trump is not, I think by anyone's estimation, a deep person of faith. The whole question of how he's courted the religious right so successfully is a political question that we can get to. But in terms, I don't think he's on any kind of personal path like that. And I think some of his behavior, personal behavior, is in the way he talks to people and the way he talks about people is all an extension of that or a reflection of that. I think I was inspired by President Bush because I write about my mother's alcoholism, and she was arrested when I was 15, and I was in the car for drunk driving, and that was a difficult passage. And she's been sober for almost 40 years now since that night. And President Bush dealt with his drinking problem by turning to faith and making a greater commitment to God, and that changed his life, and it set him on a path to become President of the United States. And so I respected what that relationship with God meant to him. I think he was unfairly maligned for being irrational in his faith, that somehow God was telling him to do certain things, and that led him to take certain decisions. I think, as he described faith to me, it was a port in the storm. It was in ways I identify with, which is keeping him on a path that he needed to be on, a kind of discipline. And so I was inspired by that, and I was very interested in his story. And he's the one when I went to go see him, and when I got the job at Meet the Press. And I remember I spent a lot of time with him, so I would mimic him all the time, which I don't think he fully appreciated as much as I thought he would. And, but mostly that, I think, anyway, you'll decide, but I mean, I think my imitation is pretty good, and I don't feel like he fully appreciates how good it is. But
we should hear it, I think.
Yeah, so I come in and I go into the Oval Office, and he's waiting for me. He says, "Stand up straight, girls, here he is. Meet the press." And he once said to me, "Gregory, I feel like I've spent a whole lifetime with you." But anyway, we get to talking, and he said, "Gregory, how's your faith?" And that's the title of the book. And I thought, wow, what a question to ask. First of all, none of your damn business. Second of all, no, I didn't say that because I welcomed the question. He knew that I was studying with a Jewish scholar and that I was on this path, and so he was interested. But I thought, wow, what a question. And it was actually one of the great things about him, that he would formulate a question like that, just kind of guy he is. Whether you like him or dislike him about his politics, but he's just a great man. Because that question is something, whether you're a person of faith or not, is really worth spending time with. How is your faith? Is it as deep as it was when you were a kid? Do you have faith? Would your life be better if your faith were deeper? I mean, these are all questions, and they can be no. The answer can be no. But spending time with the question was something that I thought was an amazing invitation at examining my own life. And so I was already on that path when he asked that question, but I found it really resonant with me. And so, yeah, I think, the whole role of faith in public life is strange. I wish we could get to a point where we could talk about faith in politicians' lives in ways that didn't devolve into, so are you pro-abortion or anti-abortion rights? Where do you come down on that? Or what about gay marriage? I wish it were about how faith motivates them. I think Tim Kaine is a great example of someone who lives and walks his faith as a Catholic, and I thought he brought it into the campaign in I thought a beautiful way, but it's not normally how we talk about that, and a lot of people who are not people of faith and who really reject the idea of blurring the lines between faith and the separation that we appropriately have in our country.
And how do we get, that might be too big of a question, but how do we bring that about? How do we separate a faith tradition from your political standing?
I don't know. My wife and I debate this because I'm for asking more pointed questions about God and where is God for you? And just because I'm interested in the answer. And the role that, I guess everybody's got a faith story, so I think it's interesting to hear a faith story in a politician. and what role that plays in their life, how it motivates them, what the limits are, how they reconcile it to positions they've taken. So in other words, if you're a Catholic who's a Democrat and you're against abortion but pro-abortion rights, what's that path like for you? But again, these are big questions that need to be resolved, but I don't think that, I don't think the church has a role in dictating, whether abortion is legal or not in the country. I mean, it's going to influence a lot of people, and it'll even influence politicians. But I wish we could just get beyond those questions to talk about some of these questions, because you shouldn't be praying to God about whether to, launch a strike against North Korea, but you certainly, in my view, would probably want to pray to God to give you strength and the courage of your convictions when you're going through that trial. Now, other people may be very uncomfortable with that, and I respect that too. But I think as a religious country, we've had this demand that our politicians be people of faith, as long as they don't take it too far.
Yeah.
But that we used to express it. I mean, Lincoln did in his second inaugural. FDR, quoting scripture, on the eve of important battles. That has fallen out of favor, I think, in society.
And it seems as Trump has put it in, it's a political tool.
It's a political tool for a lot of politicians.
Has it always been a political tool?
Yeah, I think it's a political tool for all people. And I think the question about Trump and evangelicals is something that's more nuanced, that gets into some of the broader questions we can talk about politically, which is, I think there's a lot of people in America who feel adrift. They feel left out by the political class, by the media class, by the financial, elites of the country, and they feel like they're suspect, and what they believe is suspect, and that if they have a problem with gay marriage, then they're bigots, and that if they're an evangelical Christian, that they're bigots. And he basically said to them in a way that was both politically adroit, exploitive, and opportunistic, look, I will be your voice. You don't need to be marginalized. We can stand up to these influences that make you feel bad. The culture, look how quickly the culture changed and how gay rights, shot forward. Look at what's happening on college campuses, where there seems to be an abridgment of free speech. Look at what a lot of people feel is political correctness taking hold. People feel like they can't have, safe conversations. People feel marginalized. All these things are happening. And I think Trump has found a way to say, I can bust through all that. And people like that. And it doesn't make them bigots. And it doesn't mean they're all, they're not all angry white guys. I mean, there's a reason why Trump won, is because he touched some of this, and that's what liberals have to come to grips with, that they've gone way overboard in how they're casting some of society's ills, and there was a reaction to that. So in the case of faith, I think evangelical Christians, Christian conservatives who vote as a bloc, are much more pragmatic. So they don't care whether he's a Christian in the way they'd like him to be a Christian. They just see him as a strong figure. As a friend of mine who's is a big leader in the Christian conservative movement, he said, look, David, even Jews wanted a king. And so the point is, and Jews did want a king, even though the prophet said that was going to be a bad deal for them. And they still wanted it because they wanted to be like everybody else. Well, in this way, the idea was like, we want a strong leader who's going to, kind of represent us, even if he's, and what does that voting bloc care about? Probably more than anything, abortion rights, but the Supreme Court. And Trump, named a terrific Supreme Court justice, in their view and in the view of conservatives.
So for that voting bloc, is there any place he can go too far that they're going to say, you know what, I can't support you beyond this point? Or are they, because they're
maybe, but I haven't seen it yet. I mean, his approval rating is down to about 39%. And his approval rating among Republicans has come down sharply. But it hasn't collapsed, which is what makes him so unpredictable. Next year in the midterms and in 2020, Republicans, again, it has softened, it has not collapsed. Now, he's losing everybody else, but, that's still just his approval rating. We haven't gotten into a contest where it's him against someone else. And once that happens, I think Democrats have a lot of figuring out to do.
How do we have productive conversations across the aisle amongst, even if you're not a politician or a member of the media, when you're talking to someone who is of that voting bloc or voted for Hillary? How do you have productive conversations? I think that's also touches upon faith, because you're in this.
Well, so here's maybe the bridge into a political conversation, which is, I think there's a notion of spiritual citizenship. A spiritual citizenship to me is about both living our values, walking our values, but it's also understanding that we have an obligation to look after one another. And so for me, that touches very deeply on the immigration question, because I cannot and will not separate the fact that I'm Jewish from the immigration question. And that was us. Jews were kept out of this country for irrational reasons, for anti-Semitic reasons by our government, and many of them died because of those reasons. So I am not, to be a Jew is to remember the stranger, because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. So that's just fundamental to what I believe. So I can't separate that from questions of immigration. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be security and all the rest. So that's this notion of looking after one another, I think, is important. I had this experience with a Muslim Pakistani driver who drives me a lot in Washington, D.C., and it's right around the time of the inauguration, and he gets pulled over for a moving violation, a legitimate moving violation. But the officer is screaming at him and says, "If you ever do that again, I will take your head off." He said, "I will take everything from you." And I remember how shocked I was by this, and thinking, people were asking me, "Did you record it?" And I said, "No. I mean, I'm a privileged white guy. I don't think about recording my interactions with the police because I only have favorable interactions with the police. I have not had what a lot of African Americans or others experience. So I didn't. And I didn't see his name. But I put it on my Twitter feed and immediately got a response from the mayor's office, from the head of the police, and from in the Washington Post. And the guy, my driver, didn't want to pursue anything, but he did get a call from the field commander of the police department in Washington saying, "Look, I'm sorry this happened. It shouldn't have happened. Here's my cell phone number. If you have a problem, call me back again." And my friend Mohammed called me back later, and he thanked me profusely. And I said, "Look, man," I said, "we're in this life together, okay? So that's why I did that. It's like what happens to you matters to me and vice versa." So there's an aspect of that I think we ought to remember in our spiritual citizenship. And then I would apply it further. Wendell Berry, the beautiful poet, writes that we've got to learn to imagine lives that are unlike our own. And I don't always do a great job of this. I'm not one who, even as a journalist, I did a horrible job understanding what was happening in the country that would have led to Trump being elected. And that was my fault. I mean, I'm just, spend too much time on Nantucket, and not connected enough. No, seriously. I mean, I don't, I deserve, to be criticized for not being in touch enough of what's really going on. And I think a lot of journalists, are in that position. But I think really imagining lives that are not like ours, to understand what may be motivating people. And I mean, I have no problem calling out, the white supremacist, and really condemning that. I'm not really interested in spending time, understanding where they're coming from. That needs to be reviled and condemned and marginalized because we've been down that road. But, if there's somebody who, votes for Trump, I want to understand where they're coming from. Is there, are you just a Republican, or was there something else motivating you? I think we could all do well to do. So I think that's the bridge toward, and it's not easy because we're at a time of deep ideological split. But that's almost charming compared to where we are now. Where we are now is much uglier, which is we're really pitted against each other because we have a president who is especially going out of his way to say that there are people who have to be stopped by all means. There are, journalists who have to be stopped. There are institutions that have to be stopped because they're fake. And he is deliberately saying things that are untrue to pit people against each other. Trying to equivocate between what happened in Charlottesville was an example of that. That is just woeful lack of leadership.
Would you say it's a symptom of that leadership, or was that going to happen regardless, or are they emboldened by this leadership?
I think Trump is symptomatic of some other things that are going on. I don't think it's fair to blame him. I really don't. There's lots of things to blame him for if you disagree with him. But I think it's way too facile to start blaming Trump for Charlottesville. Now, what I would say is that I think it's an objective fact. Trump has given room to white nationalists, white supremacists, because they have supported him and he's failed to condemn them. He may not want to dignify it, but he sent signals that they're okay. And the part of the way you send signals is some of the images that he perpetuated on social media, or failing to condemn David Duke, saying, I don't know who David Duke is or what he's about. Where have you been, under a rock? I mean, that's just not acceptable. You're running for president of the United States. And by the way, he has Jewish grandchildren. His grandchildren would be murdered if these people's ideology held sway. It's just wrong. So, and he's got a guy who, what Steve Bannon is, what he's not, it's really not for me to judge, but he's part of those who have given space to the fringy part of the right that has been for Trump, and that I think he's been advised not to alienate. And that's why you've seen what you've seen over the past few days. But I want to put on the table let's remember what Charlottesville is about. First of all, these neo-Nazis, skinheads, white nationalists, whatever, they do what they do to provoke a response and to get attention. What they do is deliberately go out to places as ugly as they can be so that they can get into violent clashes with people. So it's carried on the news so that they get more attention, and then they can start to blame the news media and leftists and all the rest. That's what they do. Now, we should absolutely, so what do you say? I'm a Jew, I hate what they do. Or for any of us who are going to oppose their racism and all the rest, we have to protect their right to do that, because that's what America is. That's not the America they want, but it's the America they deserve because they're citizens of our country and because America is bigger than them. And what we stand for is bigger than them. But what they're doing is they are protesting the removal of these Confederate monuments. And this, all of a sudden, people would say, oh, it's political correctness gone crazy. They want to take down all these monuments. I have a different view, which is, it's about time we had this conversation. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, how many black families have to go to send their kids to schools in parts of the country where there are monuments to people who wanted to enslave them? Monuments, by the way, to enemies of America. General Robert E. Lee, who was a great American, who fought brilliantly in the Mexican campaign, was honorable how he surrendered. I understand he was a Virginian through and through, and maybe quite honorable. He was an enemy of the United States. He made a critically horrible choice, and he fought to protect the enslavement of black people. Now, that's, I've talked to some of our brightest general leaders. They can't find a reason why these people should be lionized in this way without any context whatsoever. My kid plays basketball, so we drive all over Virginia going to tournaments. And I say, do you know who this person was? Who's at the gym that we're playing at? No idea. Well, this is who they were. I tell my daughter, this is where their history. He was a great Confederate, general, but he was a Confederate general. And we have this conversation about whether it's appropriate. So, in other words, these conversations are big. These are big topics. They're emotional topics. But that's going on. And that really doesn't have anything to do with Trump. That's just going on anyway.
Yeah.
But he could, as a leader, he could shepherd us into a dialogue that might be constructive instead of saying, well, there's hate on all sides and they weren't all white supremacists out there. And what happened in Charlottesville was gross, and it was an act of terrorism. I mean, this was a skinhead or a neo-Nazi who decided to drive his car and kill, counter-protesters. I mean, there's no other way. It's easy. I mean, it's easy to describe.
Right. On the point of the monuments, though, what do you say to someone that says, this is my heritage, and I feel like it's under attack by having these monuments removed? It kind of goes back to the point of this was a voting bloc that felt like they were being misrepresented. And how do you create a dialogue with those folks that's productive and not feeling like you're attacking them?
You know, I probably, I would probably need to think more and have a little bit more humility. I'm in more of my self-righteous stage on this question, which is, I believe in America, and so I think there's only one answer. You know, they didn't, and I think clarity of history should bring this into sharper relief. Now, if my grandfather fought for the Confederacy, I would still love my grandfather and understand with the benefit of hindsight that that was a horrible decision. And if nothing else, we should contextualize all of these monuments. I mean, I took a tour down in New Orleans. There are monuments to people down there who led Ku Klux Klan rallies. I mean, it's stupid. And so, you know, again, I'm willing in my head and my heart to have a fulsome, you know, recollection of General Lee, but I think clarity of history would lead me to make a judgment. And I'm with the Union side. I'm with America. And so that's where I come down. That sounds a little obnoxious, I think. And so I think if, you know, to have a thoughtful conversation would require, you know, the Shelby Foots of the world, you know, to be part of that conversation, to help me think about this a little bit differently rather than just my dug-in position that I am feeling at the moment, which, you know, again, I think some of it's generational, but I just don't think people are thinking it through. That's what bothers me, is that yes, these are all our brothers and sisters, they were Americans, but they were actually enemies of what is America. And if things had gone differently, you know, we'd be two different countries. So I think that it's a fraught topic, and I don't want the white nationalists or the Ku Klux Klan to be dictating the terms of this conversation we had. I don't think David Duke, who, you know, the reason these guys, they look like Nazis because they emulate Nazis, which is, you know, even, you know, farther than, you know, what we had in the Confederacy. So I don't think they should get to dictate what this conversation is.
We're 6 months into the presidency, a little bit more than that, and we're in a standoff with North Korea. What is your greatest concern, not necessarily just with that, but what is your greatest concern as an American citizen?
Well, I'm very concerned about North Korea and foreign policy generally, because I think America still plays an indispensable role in the world. And I think we've been going through a lot of ferment since 2001 about how much power we want to project in the rest of the world and how we try to solve problems that we cannot solve on our own. We really couldn't solve the problem of Afghanistan, and we're not going to. We really couldn't solve the problem of Iraq, and we're not going to. We have stabilized them some, but there's got to be the work of our allies and local forces there that begin to put that on a more sustainable heading. North Korea is really frightening, I think, because of miscalculation. I just don't, there's an excellent piece by Mark Bowden in the Atlantic a couple of months ago about can North Korea be stopped? And there really aren't any good options. There's a reason why Harry Truman, you know, stopped short in the Korean War. There are really no good options. We probably have to accept that North Korea is a nuclear power and find ways to contain it. So I worry about miscalculation. I actually think the Trump administration is probably pursuing this with a little bit more strategic thinking than impulsivity. I worry about how the president expresses himself because I think he's not giving Kim any room to maneuver. And I just think that anybody needs that room to maneuver. You know, I want our economy to do well. I think it is doing well. I can't explain that completely. I think that may be happening despite what the administration is doing, and in some cases because of expectations of what the administration could do. I worry about what Trump is doing in terms of sowing doubt about the media. The media has its own problems. We don't need somebody who's really, you know, a propagandist against the news media, talking about fake news. It's not fake news. I worry about authoritarianism. I worry about this penchant for authoritarianism, his flirtation with authoritarianism. I don't think he is that. I think America is stronger than that. I think our institutions are stronger than that. But he flirts with it in a way that I find reprehensible in our commander-in-chief and in a president of the United States, because that's not what America is. And so I worry about those tendencies. I worry about his lack of discipline. And because the lack of discipline, it's not a question of whether I'm personally offended by it or not, that's kind of irrelevant, but it gets in the way of him accomplishing things for our country. And I think tax reform is a good idea. I think infrastructure is a really good idea. I think there should be changes to Obamacare that are productive. But what gets in the way of all of that is his lack of discipline. So I think 6 months in, you see somebody who's got a chaotic White House. And he was supposed to be the one who's going to, he runs such a great business that he was going to run it really well. We have strained relationships with our allies, which happens, and he can come back from that. But I think he needs to find a way to get us away from some of the social division. We can have ideological division, that's going to happen, but the social division, I think, is more dangerous, and I think we all feel a little bit more frayed endings. It's harder to talk about politics in our social circles, arguably now, or with family than it's been before. And I think he can do something to change that. And so the big piece, the Russia investigation, if I had to guess, I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Really?
I don't. I think, I don't know that, but and if there is something, I think it's going to be probably financial crimes. I do think Russia tried very hard to penetrate the campaign, the Trump campaign, with the idea of influencing them. I think there's a combination of naivete, hubris, arrogance, and pure inexperience that contributed to some of these contexts. And I actually think the biggest failure of judgment is about Putin himself, that Trump thinks that there's no danger there, and he thinks that somehow he can, work with him, not realizing that this is a different game that Putin is playing, and he's really trying to undermine our democracy, and that Trump makes that easier when he doesn't condemn him, when he plays footsie with him, when he doesn't accept what the intelligence community says about the infiltration of the campaign. Those are serious things, but I just don't know that anybody committed a crime. I mean, I think there was some horrible judgment, but I don't know that anybody committed a crime. And if nothing comes of it, Trump he wants this fight. He'll fight this to the death, and I think he'll run on it. I think he'll run on it essentially saying that the government came after me, the vestiges of the Obama administration came after me, Democrats came after me, and the media came after me, and there was nothing there. And we'll see how it shakes out. But I see him kind of building that campaign in his head.
I want to leave time to ask questions from the audience, but I want to ask you one last question. What's the conversation happening within the hallways of CNN, or within the media, when they are being so forcefully attacked by the most powerful person on the planet? Is it motivating them, and how do they remain objective when they're being personally attacked in that way? Yeah,
I mean, it's the right question. I think, the world of journalism had a lot of reckoning to do with ourselves about what we got wrong about this campaign. Relying on big data, trying to predict the results too much. That's one of the things I think we've gotten, wrong, is trying to predict outcomes instead of reflecting where people are, having good conversations. That Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, I was on with him this morning. Consider that an act of journalism. It's memoir, but it's also an act of journalism because it's an expression of listening to people. And it's narrative. And I think there should be more of that in journalism. We ought to look less at how we predict political results and more on how we chart how the culture is influencing politics, how the economy is changing politics. Look more from the outside in than constantly from the inside out. And I think, you got to stand up for democracy. I mean, you got to stand up for freedom of the press. I think there is nothing short of complete vigilance and pushback when you face a president of the United States who accuses CNN and others of being fake news. That is wrong. It's wrong on its face. The president rode to national political prominence on the back of a lie, a racist lie against President Obama. It's a fact. That's what he did. And that's his history. And he's president of the United States. I accept that. He's my president. But that's also true. And so as journalists, we have an obligation to push back against that. And if people watching say, oh, well, you're a bunch of liberals, I'm like, okay, fine. That's how you want to call it? That's how you're going to call it. But that's not right. And the media is so divided against itself that that's just going to happen. He always deserves a fair shake. always. And that's what the conversations are about. It's pushing back hard if he's saying stuff that's not true, and standing up for what the facts are, and being vigilant about that. But it's giving people their due. I think being better listeners. I think these are the conversations that have to happen. And I think journalism is in a great place, actually, because, look, this guy is great copy. There's no question about it. There's an entertainment value. We feel it, even as we're talking about the grave issues. Now, I could use a little less entertainment myself, but we're compelled to pay attention. And that has been a boon to journalism, not just infotainment, which cable, everybody can slip into that. You've seen the Washington Post, the New York Times redouble their efforts to dedicate the resources to the kind of journalism that can really get to answers, even better than television can. That matters. And so those conversations have happened. Social media is a real problem, and I think I go back and end on this point, Rob, which is part of understanding each other is getting outside of our echo chambers. And they're so solidified and ossified now because you can be on Twitter, you can be on Facebook, and if you're on those platforms, you don't have to ever see anything that you disagree with. You can cater it in such a way that you only get what you want, and you can turn on Fox News or you can turn on MSNBC. You can create content that validates your view of the world. That's not right. We should be challenging ourselves to challenge ourselves. Why do I think this? I'm all worked up about this Confederate issue. Okay, well, am I being a little arrogant about that? Should I understand somebody else's point of view on that? What about there's aspects of Trump, I don't need other points of view on, but there's some understanding that I do need a point of view on. This whole business that happened at Google. I think there's a conversation to be had about this. My wife and I have these conversations all the time. So I think we have to be open to challenging ourselves in a way that lets us be more open in conversation with others. And we got to think about bringing the temperature down. My wife is always, if I'm talking to somebody, she's like, whoa, easy. But we could all use a little bit of that right now. Just let's be a little easier. Let's speak a little bit more softly. And maybe we can turn some of that down.
Yes, sir.
There's a Native American saying that I like a lot, that you do and Philip does, and it basically says, it's a good thing to have found the way, but it's not the only way.
Right.
They are all ways.
Yep.
So that's one. The second idea is we have friends, and throughout the world, there are massive numbers of people who say, no, my way, it is the
right.
correct and only way.
Right.
Is it worth, in your view, engaging that conversation on Facebook?
Yes, I think there is, because I just don't think that doesn't work for me, because it just doesn't have any place in my life. Somebody told me about a bumper sticker that says, I don't know, wait. Yeah, basically, I don't know and you don't either. No, maybe it was better than that. Anyway, the point is, I'm sorry, I forgot it. I thought I had it, but I didn't. But I think it is worth, I told the story to my Kentucky friends over here. There was Russell Moore, who's a terrific guy. You see him on the news. He's basically the political and policy wing of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he's been very supportive of my efforts with the book and all that, and that's great. But I went to go see him. And he said to me, essentially, what you're doing is all fine and charming, your journey, but you have to decide who God is. So you either accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, or we would consider you incomplete. And I just said, I didn't understand what he was saying, or was like, oh, right, because I'm Jewish. I said, okay, got it. I said, look, I'm cool with that. I said, look, maybe Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and I haven't figured that out yet. I'm just not overly concerned about resolving the question. I may have more to go. Maybe I'm incomplete, but this is, as far as I understand my relationship with God, he's okay with me right here. And so, yes, I think it's worth, with humility, engaging that conversation. And some people don't want to have it. Some Jews don't want to have it, right? With me, right? Because I'm, So, yes, I always think and I think progressive religion has got to find its way. It's got to assert itself because it's being left out, because people associate faith with the most obviously faithful. That's the trap. I fell into that trap too initially. And it's because progressives don't have their mojo. They don't have their voice. They've got to find a way to assert that. And so, yeah, I'm all for that conversation. And I think that the expression that you mentioned is great. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Perhaps you mentioned this in your book, but I'm curious to hear how you define the word faith. Because I hear faith and belief used interchangeably.
Yeah.
I see a distinction between the two.
For you, what's the distinction?
I think that when you ask people, how's your faith?
Yeah.
You'll hear about their beliefs, which are often fixed notions about how things should be or outcomes, which starts to blend into religion, where faith is something that is more open-ended. It lets go. It doesn't cling to one idea of what's so. It is a journey. You made a little light of being on a journey, but faith to me is more about a journey and exploration and inquisitive. My belief to me is a little more fixed.
Yeah, I'd go with that. I'm good with that. I mean, I guess what I would just add to it by saying, for me, I think faith can get a little more fixed. In other words, if I have faith in myself, I have faith in you as a human being. I have faith in God, that God is there, that God loves me, that God is guiding me, that God, as Annie Lamott writes in one of her books, she's like, God loves you for who you are, but too much to let you stay this way. So I've got that faith. But for me, it's not dogma. Because even things that I believe in, I'm not totally sure, but things that I've experienced, I'm like, yeah, I'm good on that. One of my, somebody I learned from, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was a former chief rabbi of Great Britain, says, if you believe in God, you can rest assured that God pretty much believes in you. So that for me is where faith is. So I think it does cling for me, but it still has room to grow and it can be open. But I go back to, yes, I'm journeying, but it doesn't mean that I'm not arriving. I can keep arriving. Maybe that place of arrival changes, but I'm willing to go with what you said too. That works for me too. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the challenge of having different belief systems come together in the public sphere. K-12 education is one of those pieces of the sphere. What do you believe in public education and that it's possible in this intersection?
What are you asking? Do I believe in teaching?
Well, you've got to put there, at a certain, it's kind of like, in a certain sense, it's the question of what do you do with the statute? Because at a certain point, there's a curriculum.
Right.
You have to put together to teach children, and do you teach children in the same way, in a public, with a curriculum that is composed to recognize the existence of many different
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit, I have maybe slightly unorthodox views about this, which is that I wish they taught religion in public education. I'd be cool with that. I mean, I think they should teach world religions. I think we should learn about lots of different religions. But, so that's just me. And I realize that just may be because I'm on this path and I'm good with it. I don't know that that's the appropriate policy prescription. But, I think it's tricky. I just think that there's utility in helping people understand where people are coming from by having that be part of the curriculum. It doesn't have to be dogmatic, but religion is such a powerful motivation for good and ill in our history. Why shouldn't we know that? And why can't you understand what motivates people or understand the basics of, I just think that's critical. And I believe that as a person of faith, but, I just think we all should know that anyway. I mean, I'd like for Jews to understand more about Judaism. That's where I've started, because most Jews don't know anything about Judaism. So yeah, that's where I come down on that, which is, so yeah, it's certainly a tricky question. Yeah.
Two-part question, following on faith and belief in faith. How do you distinguish between spirituality and religion?
That's a good one.
The second part is your faith journey to, have you explored Hinduism and Buddhism in the process?
You know, only superficially. So I have a lot to learn, and there's a lot of great stuff to learn, but that has not been my focus. I haven't really studied Islam in great depth either, so there's much more work to do. I mean, I try to stick with my monotheism. That's about all. I'm still trying to learn that before I move on to other gods as well. but I mean, again, I'm open. But the spirituality versus religion thing, I think, is related to faith and belief, because I think it is about this relationship with God. The sense, to me, spirituality is about this relationship with God in a sense of that I'm being watched, that God is always watching, that the microphone is always on. And that sense of, the Psalms talk about God's presence, that even if I should fly to the westernmost horizon, even there, your hand will be there on my shoulder guiding me. And so that notion of the existence and the presence of the Spirit, and now I'm getting a little close outside of my Judaism zone into Christianity, but that presence of the Spirit. Again, if you read the Psalms, this is what I always say to fellow Jews, they're so spiritual. If you talk about God's presence and that all we want is to gaze upon God and His temple, I mean, it sounds very Christian, but so that's what we have in common. That I think is different than a set of religious codes and commandments that are prescriptive. And so I think sometimes people who say, oh, well, I'm spiritual, I still believe in rooting yourself in a faith tradition. That's what works for me. Because I think there can be a lot of, people who are thinking, well, I'm a spiritual person, and maybe they find that through nature, maybe they find it through mindfulness, which I think is great, which gets, I think, into a little bit more of Eastern religion, which I think is incredibly powerful. And I've talked to guys like Sam Harris, the atheist, who I spent an hour and a half talking to him about, the experience of goodness and love for other people that he experienced through mindfulness and drugs in some cases, that didn't have to be about God. I don't know the answer ultimately, but I'm interested in the question.
Just this week I started reading Mortality by Christopher Hitchens.
Mm.
And I don't know too much about him. It's the first book I've read, but he's not really big on religion or on God. How would you respond to him when he would say that it's kind of intellectually naive to believe in God? And it's,
I'd say maybe he knows more than I do. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't debate him on faith, but I've watched some of these debates, and here's where I would come down. I think people who make that argument think that it is a crutch of some kind, that it's something emotional, and that it is not. It is a surrender of intellectual rigor to be a person of faith. Rabbi Sachs talks about how science can explain the what, but not necessarily the why. And that makes sense to me. I just don't have all the answers. But a friend of mine, Larry Hoffman, is a rabbi in New York. He says, I don't like this question so much of do you believe in God? It's like asking somebody, do they believe in love? I think we come to know love. That the Sarah Vaughan song about this queasy feeling, it must be love. And we all have that experience. When you fall in love, you're like, geez, I don't know. Oh yeah, I'm sick, I'm crazy. Oh right, I'm in love. So I happen to believe that about faith. It's not something I would have grown up saying, but all I know is that I've had the experience of God, of the divine, of grace in my life, of true humility, and of feeling my life, a kind of, as the famous psalm says, that we walk through the valley of death. Thankfully, we don't stay there, but we walk through the valley of death in various trials, and that God resets our life. And I've had that experience. So I think that would be my answer, which is you don't have to accept it. I don't have to feel judged, just that it's not a question of belief. This is not a choice. This is, I've come to know this, and it's beautiful, and that's how I view it. Yes, ma'am.
Was there an epiphany moment that sort of set you on this journey?
No, not really. I mean, I've had moments, usually more painful moments, and that's around what happened at NBC and kind of a loss of identity and really struggling with that as a person and making mistakes around that. But I think that really it originated with a sense of gratitude, of feeling overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, this is so many wonderful things are happening in my life. And also a sense of responsibility. My kids were young and interfaith marriage, and Beth, my wife, really charged me with leading the way in our family on faith. And I didn't want to get it wrong. I really wanted to get it right. And so I felt a desire to understand and have purpose on a higher level. And that felt like an epiphany. I think I have had epiphanies through, when I lost my job, especially in such a high-profile way, I really went through that sense of, well, if I'm not on TV and I don't have that job, then maybe I don't matter. Then why would anybody want to pay attention to me if I don't have all of that? And that was a pretty alienating feeling and a pretty bankrupt feeling, right? That I couldn't get into closer touch with who I am and what really matters about who I am, independent of that. That was my own shortcoming. So for me, I did experience, people ask about humility, to experience, David Brooks in his book, The Road to Character, which is such a great book, he says, humility is about really coming to grips with the fact that you're permanently an underdog against your worst traits. So that's one aspect of humility. Another aspect is being humiliated, right? And then probably the most meaningful part of being brought low is to realize, wow, I mean, I'm pretty insignificant in the scheme of things. We have that, right? If we go to the mountaintop, right? And we're like, wow, this is amazing. That gives us that feeling of how small we are. I try to carry that with me more and more often and just realize, yeah, I mean, my life is really small. I need perspective. And that felt like an epiphany. It helped me get to a place of not needing as much of what the outside world was giving me through my work. And it doesn't always work, it doesn't always work, but I know that that's real. I know that all this other crap about being on TV and the way people respond to you, that's not real. And I did come to really realize that. It doesn't mean that there aren't genuine people and there are people who like me on my work, and I think I did meaningful work. But as a general proposition, like that's just not what makes the world go around. That's not real. That's just part of the carousel of that work. That is something, my wife would say that's a pretty big epiphany, given how self-absorbed I was and can still be because of my work.
I know we want to give time for David to sign some books, but we'll take one last question, and then David will meet you down there for signing books. Yes.
I'm really impressed. I haven't read your book, but I'm dying to read it.
Thanks.
I'm very impressed with how you talk to people from so many different points of view. And I'm just very disturbed in my life now when I turn on the television and I listen to people not listening to each other.
Yeah.
They're too busy screaming at each other with their own opinions. How can we change that? Because it makes me just want to turn everything off, and yet
Yeah.
I want to hear.
Look, first of all, I've been guilty of that too, and I'll tell you this brief anecdote in answering your question. So I was on, when Trump fired Comey, I was really worked up about that because, my wife, in the book you read, my wife was a federal prosecutor. She prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombers. She's a brilliant lawyer. She's got her own law firm now, and she's just great. So I get kind of worked up because I think my wife is the best lawyer in the world. And so I get worked up on these law and order questions. And I got into this debate on TV with Ken Cuccinelli, who's the former Attorney General of Virginia. And I was offended, really, that as a former Attorney General, that he would make excuses for this, what I thought was clearly wrong. So I'm really going at him in the way that you're describing, back and forth. I'm being very self-righteous, and he's doing his thing back and forth. And my daughter was listening on the radio, driving back from a swim meet. And she says to my wife, she said, "Why is Daddy yelling?" And my wife said, you shouldn't have made it personal, and it just got too overheated. My daughter was much tougher. She said, "Daddy, why are you yelling? There's no reason to yell. You should not be doing that." I, of course, was like, I'm going to still start crying now. I mean, I was so mortified by that. And I realized that my boss at CNN loved it. Couldn't have got enough of it, right? Because it's compelling TV. My daughter pierced my heart and said, don't do that again. She's saying what you're saying. Why can't we be better at listening? So I still can fall into that trap because the TV world sets you up deliberately in a way to mix it up like that and to get self-righteous about some of these things. And some things are worth some self-righteousness, I have to say. But unfortunately, television and cable news is not the place for us to be more constructive. But we ought to think about being more mindful about it. And I will try to be more mindful of it because what you're asking is part of the answer. We can't be so dogmatic in our views that we're not given some space. But that's a product of our media culture that is setting us up that way. So that's why, it's like our son said the other night, I do want to know what's going on, but now I don't really care what these people think. And he was right, because he wanted some information, a little bit of context, and now he didn't want to hang around for all the arguing. I'm like, well, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's a pretty good perspective. We've got to bear that in mind. But you know what? We can all start. We can start tonight. And we can start by lowering the temperature in how we interact with one another. And maybe do less on social media, or maybe not engage with that friend on social media who's just sent you a rocket or sent some nasty thing about Donald Trump. So we don't get into this business of people thinking it's okay to pose with a picture of his decapitated head. Because it's not about him, it's about the presidency. And we always have to remember that. And part of what I really do love our country, because part of what makes our country great is that we're going to be okay. I mean, this is hard, this is challenging that we're pitted against each other. But as I said to an audience recently, I said, let's talk about something that was really hard. Let's talk about 1863. The Civil War's going on a couple of years. I mean, everybody's touched by the Civil War. Abolitionists are starting to wonder, is this really worth it? The real carnage, people have lost their brothers and sons, and there's food rations, and people are wondering, where are we headed? Are we going to survive this? That was stressful. I'm pretty confident we're going to be okay, as hard as this is. So, a note of optimism. At least it's not the Civil War. We can take that around.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Okay.
Thank Rob very much. I also want to thank our sponsors in the magazine, the Hale Family Foundation. David's going to be downstairs signing his book. If you'd like to get a copy of it, it's a wonderful read. So thank you all very much. We hope to see you Thursday night with Tim Messer. Thanks, Rob.